Now our loyalty is on the line, not to the disfellowship person, but to God, who is watching to see whether we will abide by his command.
The body is so happy to be able to release the New World Translation Revised Greek.
In 1919, the Watchtower says something extraordinary happened. Jesus supposedly inspected his followers and selected a faithful slave. But there's a question almost impossible to avoid. What exactly was being taught when that selection supposedly happened? To answer it, we have to go back. Not to 2013, not to the modern governing body, but to the publications being produced around 1917, 1918, and 1919. In July 1917, the Bible students released a book that would become one of the most famous publications in their early history, The Finished Mystery. It was presented as an explanation of biblical prophecy, particularly material from Revelation and related books, and it wasn't a minor publication. The Watchtower's own historical material says the book was distributed extensively. By the end of 1917, plans were already underway for a massive additional printing. Then something happened. The book attracted enormous opposition. In February 1918, Canadian authorities prohibited the book, and in March 1918, the United States government took action against the publication. The Watchtower later described this period as part of the intense opposition facing the Bible students. But for our investigation, there's something more important than the controversy surrounding the book. It's what the book actually taught. Imagine the claim from the other direction. Suppose Jesus really was inspecting his followers. Suppose he really was looking for the faithful slave. Then, what would we expect to find? We would at least expect to find the teachings that the organization was presenting as spiritual food during that period. And that's where the finished mystery becomes important. The book contained highly specific interpretations of biblical prophecy. Some involved dates, some involved political events, some involved religious institutions. And some interpretations are so unusual that they sound almost unbelievable today. For example, the book connected the biblical figure of Leviathan with a steam locomotive. It also interpreted the symbolic imagery involving Michael and his angels in a way connected with the Pope and Roman Catholic bishops. These aren't modern critics inventing bizarre claims about an old publication. The point is much simpler. These interpretations are found in the historical material itself. And that gives us something much more valuable than an accusation. It gives us a document. But the most important evidence isn't even the strange symbolism. It's the chronology. 1917, 1918, 1920, 1921. The finished mystery contained expectations involving specific years. Some of those expectations concerned 1918, others concerned 1920, and still others extended into 1921. The book anticipated dramatic events involving Christendom, political systems, and the heavenly calling. Some of these expectations did not unfold as the book had anticipated. That fact creates an important historical question. Not, did every prediction come true? The historical record can answer that. But something deeper. What happened to the organization's interpretation when the expected events didn't unfold as anticipated? Because prophetic interpretation doesn't exist in a vacuum. It affects the credibility of the person or institution making the interpretation. And this is where the story becomes complicated. The year 1918 arrived. World War I was still raging. The Bible students were experiencing enormous pressure. Their leaders were arrested and imprisoned. Their publications were restricted. Their preaching activity was disrupted. From the organization's later perspective, this period became part of the story of persecution and testing. But decades later, another interpretation would be attached to this period. According to the Watchtower's later doctrine, Jesus had arrived to inspect his followers in 1918, and then in 1919 came the selection of the faithful slave. This is where the historical timeline and the theological interpretation meet. But there's something else we need to remember. The organization wasn't sitting silently in 1918 waiting for Jesus to reveal the answer. It was actively producing and distributing spiritual literature, including the material we've just examined. So the question becomes sharper. If 1918 was the inspection, What exactly was being inspected? This is the year at the center of the entire story. The Watchtower eventually taught that Jesus selected capable anointed brothers in 1919 as the faithful and discreet slave.
Since 1919 of our Common Era, Jehovah and Jesus trust the imperfect slave.
That claim became foundational, because once the organization identified itself with the faithful slave, another conclusion followed. The organization had divine authority to provide spiritual instruction. And that authority was not simply based on having good Bible teachers. It was based on Jesus' supposed selection. But here's where we need to slow down. Was that exactly what the organization was saying in 1919? Or did the interpretation develop later? That distinction matters, because historical doctrines don't become true simply because later publications place them in the past. We have to trace the evidence, and when we do, we discover something fascinating. The Watchtower's understanding of the faithful slave and the 1918-1919 chronology changed over time. There's another detail that makes this history more complicated. If the finished mystery contained expectations that later became problematic, one might assume the organization simply abandoned it. But the historical record shows something different. In June 1920, the Bible students began a major campaign to distribute a paperback edition of the finished mystery, known as ZG. Think about that for a moment. The book had been at the center of controversy. Government authorities had restricted it. The war had ended. And yet, the organization was still actively distributing it. That doesn't automatically prove that the organization believed every statement in the book remained correct, and we shouldn't pretend it does. But it does establish something important. The book remains significant enough to be used in a major distribution campaign. And that gives us another question. What happened to its prophetic expectations, and how did the organization later explain them? Now jump forward more than 60 years. February 15, 1981. The Watchtower published an article emphasizing the need for the faithful and discreet slave organization in understanding the Bible. This is where the historical issue becomes more than a debate about an old book, because the organization was now making an explicit argument about where biblical authority was located. The logic was essentially, God has provided a faithful slave. The slave provides spiritual food. Therefore, Christians need the channel God has provided. But that raises a fundamental question. How do we know who the faithful slave is? The answer brings us right back to 1919. And therefore, the historical claim about 1919 isn't merely an interesting piece of Watchtower history. It becomes part of the foundation for organizational authority. And then, in 2013, something changed. The July 15, 2013 Watchtower announced an adjustment in the understanding of Jesus' prophecy about the faithful slave. The previous explanation had connected Jesus' inspection with 1918 and his appointment of all his belongings with 1919. But the organization now said that this understanding needed adjustment. The new explanation shifted the chronology. The inspection was no longer presented simply as a single event in 1918. Instead, the organization described Jesus as coming for inspection over a broader period beginning in 1914 and extending into early 1919. And the appointment over all the master's belongings was moved into the future. But, and this is crucial, the Watchtower did not abandon the 1919 selection claim. It continued to say that in 1919, Jesus selected capable, anointed brothers as the faithful and discreet slave. So this is not a story about the Watchtower admitting 1919 never happened. It didn't. The story is more subtle. The organization changed what happened in 1919, and that distinction is extremely important. 1918, Jesus inspects. 1919. Faithful slave appointed over all belongings. 1914, early 1919, inspection. 1919, faithful slave selected to provide food to the domestics. Future, appointment over all the master's belongings. That may sound like a technical change, but it isn't insignificant, because the interpretation of Matthew 24:47-49 had been used to explain why the organization possessed unique spiritual authority, and now the chronology had changed. The Watchtower itself described this as an adjustment in understanding. So, we're left with a historical puzzle. The organization still points to 1919, but its explanation of what happened in that year is not identical to the explanation that existed before 2013, and that leads us back to the original question. We can now separate the story into three different layers. First, what can history establish? We can establish that the finished mystery was published in 1917. We can establish that it was widely distributed. We can establish that authorities restricted it during 1918. We can establish that the Bible students later conducted another major distribution campaign involving the book. We can establish that the book contained highly specific prophetic interpretations and chronological expectations. And we can establish that the Watchtower later developed a doctrine connecting Jesus' inspection and selection of the faithful slave with the period around 1918 and 1919. Second, what changed? We can establish that the Watchtower's explanation of Matthew 24:47-49 changed significantly in 2013. The organization retained the 1919 selection claim, but changed the chronology and moved the appointment over all the master's belongings into the future. Third, what can history not establish? History cannot prove whether Jesus personally selected the organization. That is a theological claim. We can examine the evidence. We can compare the publications. We can trace the doctrine, but we cannot turn a theological belief into a laboratory experiment. And that distinction matters. Because a serious documentary shouldn't tell you that history has proven something it cannot actually prove. So perhaps the most interesting question isn't, did Jesus choose the Watchtower? That's ultimately a question of faith. The historical question is different. It is this: what was the organization teaching when it says Jesus chose it? Because that question has evidence. There are books, there are Watchtower articles, there are dates, there are changing interpretations, and there is a doctrinal explanation that was revised almost a century later. The Watchtower asks us to believe that Jesus selected the faithful slave in 1919. The historical record allows us to examine the publications surrounding that claim. And when we do, we discover something more complicated than either side's simplest version of the story. We find an organization whose understanding of prophecy developed over time. We find predictions and interpretations that later became difficult to defend. We find a powerful claim of divine appointment, and we find that the explanation of that appointment itself changed. The Watchtower still points to 1919, but after more than a century of changing explanations, the question is no longer simply what happened in 1919.
The deeper question is, what evidence connects what happened in 1919 with Jesus personally selecting this organization? The documents can tell us what the Bible students were publishing. They can tell us what the Watchtower later claimed. They can tell us what changed. Investigation isn't the one that gives you the easiest answer. It's the one that gives you the documents and asks you to read them.